Hello. Is that working? Okay, good. I would first like to thank the Kyoto University and the Symposium organizers for the invitation, and also really to inspire all of us to think deeply and critically about the issues that are really facing university museums today. So thank you very much for having me. Let's make sure I can get this to work. Okay, so the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture was founded in 1887 by a group of young Seattle men, and here's Seattle, so you know where I live. Here's Washington State, which is quite a far distance from Washington, D.C., which is what some people, they think we are in D.C., but we're not. We're way, way, way over here on the Pacific Rim. And this is an inset of Washington State, and Seattle is in what's called Puget Sound, which incidentally is subject to tsunami, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in my talk. So this is a young naturalists who were interested in scientific endeavors, and in 1889, this is a early picture of what became the Burke Museum. It's called Denny Hall on the University of Washington campus. It's the oldest building on our campus. And it became known as the Washington State Museum. Today, the Burke has celebrated its 125th anniversary about 2 years ago, and is now in the beginning stages of building a new museum that is, we're hoping will challenge the traditional ideas of a natural history museum, and I'm interested in talking to other people about what that might mean today and in the next few days. The Burke Museum's mission is to create a better understanding of the world and our place in it. The museum is responsible for Washington State collections of natural and cultural heritage and sharing the knowledge that makes them meaningful. Today, the Burke continues its legacy of collecting, researching, educating, and exhibiting, and has garnered worldwide recognition with over 12.5 million objects in the collections. Here is a list of the collections, and they include arachnology, archaeology, ethnology, genetic resources, and that's for mammals, birds, and we recently are getting a herpetology collection that's increasing pretty quickly for our genetic resources. The herbarium, herpetology, ichthyology, invertebrate and vertebrate paleontology, mammalogy, paleobotany, and ornithology. So it's a pretty diverse collection. With 65 permanent employees, the museum actively develops programming to target Washington State school children. Last year, 85,000 school students were served and 105,000 general visitors came to see our exhibits. To date, research on the collection has produced 1,810 scholarly publications, and that's probably quite a bit lower than actuality, but those are my numbers. Today I'm going to speak specifically about the archaeology collections because, well, of course those are the ones which I work, but also because I think they speak directly to one of the issues that we are hoping to address this week, and that is keeping collections and research relevant. The Burke Museum began Let's see if I can get that. Oops. The Burke Museum began acquiring archaeology collections in the late 1800s. And in the early days, little thought was given to provenience, where the artifacts originally came from, but that has changed with time. As archaeology has become more scientific, collecting provenience information for artifacts has become a priority. Some of the few artifacts donated to the Burke Museum were simply identified as coming from Washington State, but artifacts from the last half century can be precisely pinpointed, often to within a centimeter or less of their original location. This is a photograph of a 4,000 to 7,000 year old point that was found on campus just a few years ago. It's part of a recent project. The Burke archaeology collections comprise a variety of materials, including stone, bone, ivory, and ceramic materials, as well as wood. They come from locations as close as the city of Seattle and as far away as Egypt and Papua New Guinea. We have probably the largest collection of Papua New Guinea artifacts outside the United States and Australia. Not all of the archaeology collections at the Burke Museum are owned by the state of Washington. And in the United States, artifacts are owned by whomever owns the land from which the artifacts were removed. And I want to dwell on this for a minute, because although this situation is fairly unique to the United States and our property laws, the arrangements are often applicable to international collections, both cultural and natural, and are thus germane to our discussions this week regarding collaboration and reciprocity. Approximately 1/3 of the archaeology department collections come from government agencies, local, state, and federal, as well as Native American tribes. Since these collections are owned by another party, but managed by the Burke Museum, we call them held in trust collections. We store them alongside our own collections, and although some of these collections have access restrictions, most are managed to allow full access to interested parties. Today, the Burke Museum Archaeology Department curates collections specifically from the Pacific Rim, with an emphasis on the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Systematic collections comprise the bulk of the material from the last 70 years. Due to changes in funding and laws beginning in the 1990s, archaeologists, and especially students of archaeology, have changed their focus from doing field excavations to researching on the museum's collections. 3 unique examples of collections-based research are presented here to illustrate some ways that university museums might construct a reciprocal relationship between collections and research. These 3 examples include tribal and community-based research, development of a regional non-public database, and an example of how to keep research relevant from a surprising angle. In 1996, archaeologists at the Burke Museum were alerted by a local county government, counties like prefecture here, that a previously unrecorded archaeological site on an island near Seattle had been very badly damaged during the previous winter storms. So here's what's left of the archaeological site. At the time, it was unclear the extent of the site, but you can see that this is a madrona tree, and it basically has sort of taken the bank with it out into this, the water's right about here. And here's Seattle again, and this is an island right here. It's called Vashon Island. They wanted us to find out how much of the site remained intact. And typically this is the work of either a graduate student looking for a dissertation topic, or more often by the private sector, companies that help owners legally and ethically manage their cultural resources. However, the Burke suggested a collaborative excavation, and that this would bring academic and public communities together in a productive and beneficial way. The project was developed in partnership with the local tribe, the neighbors on the island, the local middle school, which is 12 to 14-year-olds, the county government, and graduate students at the University of Washington in the anthropology department. Ultimately, 375 members of the public were invited to participate in the excavation as part of our attempt to bring the community into the academic and preservation process. We actually had 75 kids under the age of 12. We could talk about how well that worked, but it's a challenge. The mutual benefits were substantial. The county and the museum received good press. It ultimately brought more researchers to the museum. The neighbors were educated at a hands-on, tangible level, and more importantly, perhaps, they also felt such a sense of stewardship that the site is continuously monitored to this day on a volunteer basis, and we get calls if one tiny little shell falls out of the bank. The graduate students, of course, got training, but also made valuable community contacts and conducted now published research. The tribe was able to improve their own community relations with the islanders and gain valuable fish population and seasonality data from the now polluted fishery. The museum holds the collection in trust for the tribe. We published a book, and since then have already had 2 additional researchers who are about to get their dissertations published on the new analysis from this site. This project demonstrates that a collaborative effort that includes broad participation from the beginning will continue to provide valuable research and resource stewardship into the future. This is a second example. This last spring, the Burke Archaeology Department received funding, about $150,000, a little bit more, to develop a centralized database for archaeology collections in Washington State. I was really struck by the talk that we had earlier on the herbaria and the herbaria index and how much is shared worldwide. Archaeologists have a lot to learn. We collaborated with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. This is the office that's in charge of permitting archaeological excavations, along with more than 30 state repositories. And here the term repository refers to places that store collections, but regardless of whether they exhibit them. So that would include not only other museums, but also academic departments. We also partnered with tribes, government agencies, and those cultural resource management firms, those private firms as well. Prior to receiving funding for this project, the Burke had been a founding member of what's called the Washington State Curation Summit. And this is a group that began meeting in 2003 to address curation issues for archaeology collections specifically, and how to deal with the fact that it's very difficult to determine the whereabouts of collections from systematic surveys and excavations. And this is because while many states in the United States have a single repository for archaeological collections found in their state, the collections in Washington State are widely distributed in various public and private museums, including historical societies, state, federal, and local repositories, etc. And actually in Washington State there are 27 museums with substantial archaeological collections. The state is not that big. And some collections are even held out of state and in international institutions. Denmark and Canada in particular have quite extensive collections from Washington State. As you can imagine, the current lack of available collections data greatly complicates the work of archaeologists. State and other government agencies waste limited funds resampling previously studied sites because they don't have access to past research. Archaeologists and graduate students who want to carry out research must blindly contact one institution after another to try to locate the material that they want to study. There's little doubt that funding for this project would not have been obtained without first partnering with all of these colleagues. The initial funding will pay for the creation of a database to be accessed securely through the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. Additionally, we will work with the Curation Summit folks, all the members, to create a list of fields necessary to ensure a useful research database. I know you can't read that, but it's just the idea of a database. Artifact material types and radiocarbon dates were identified as the most critical. Very specific object data will require a request to the requisite institution, as the institutions really need to retain control over their specific collections data. The Burke Archaeology Department's data will be used as the test data, and then additional funds will be secured to add data from throughout the state. Long-term, this project aims to serve as a clearinghouse for information inherent in archaeological collections that can yield valuable environmental and cultural planning information, as well as preservation data. It's expected that this ability to obtain content and access data about these collections will create new avenues for research. Fish, bird, mammal, and shellfish biologists have already expressed interest in this data for long-term population studies, and botanists are interested in plant diversity through time. And this is the third example here. For the last 15 years, the Burke Archaeology Department has cared for 17,000 artifacts from a 4,200-year-old Native American site in Seattle. And this is a site that was actually found by a geologist who was looking for evidence of tsunami sands in Puget Sound. There was a major earthquake 1,100 years ago in Seattle, caused a 20-foot wave, right, and covered this site. And then the land down dropped about 1.5 meters. So the site is literally underwater, and we had dewatering wells doing the excavations. This collection is an example of what I referred to earlier as a held in trust collection. The site is on county property, but is the Aboriginal territory of 3 tribes. The tribes could not agree on a tribal repository, but agreed to have the Burke care for the collection until they could come to an agreement. In the meantime, the local government established a fund to pay for the care of the collection in perpetuity, no matter who houses the collection. And this is something that we may want to talk more about when we talk about who pays for the care of collections long-term at our university museums. Additionally, a committee comprised of representatives from the 3 tribes, the Burke Museum, and the local government agencies oversees the use and access to the collections. This unique management system has curiously served to increase research and public access rather than restrict it, as one might think. The committee first created a website, which is one of the most accessed pages at the Burke Museum. It's primarily for the public, not for researchers. But you can see there's an image of the excavation and the units, and you can do searches by date, time period, and look at the objects that come from the site from those time periods, and also you can look by material type. The committee then decided that multiple portable education kits should be created to serve the 3 tribal reservations, along with public schools in the 3 surrounding counties. The tribal members were adamant that plastic replicas be avoided. They wanted people to be able to touch the real thing, but they didn't want them to damage the original. So we ended up contracting with an archaeologist who made copies of the artifacts using the same materials as the originals and making the artifacts using non-metal tools. So you can see on your left is the original artifact, and on your right is actually a slide of the archaeologist making the replica by hand. The committee is currently creating a permanent exhibit at the site, which is visited by thousands of children as part of curriculum on water quality, since the site is conveniently located at the Seattle sewage treatment plant. A third and unexpected outgrowth of this committee was new research on diet, and also a call to action. Tribal members on the committee commented that archaeology needs to be relevant to contemporary Native people. And actually I've heard this a lot, but I've sat on this committee now for 13 years, and when I first started, the tribal members said, you know, why are we spending so much money on research? Why do we do this how is this helping my people? And I heard that over and over. One of the most pressing issues for Native Americans today is diabetes, which is 3 to 9 times higher in the Native American population than in the general US population. There's growing evidence that diabetes and other chronic diseases are the result of drastic changes to diet and lifestyle in the past 150 years. In 2003, the Burke's archaeologists embarked on a project to create a comprehensive list of foods that sustained Northwest Coast peoples before Euro-American contact, in hopes that this might somehow improve people's health today. We never dreamed of the consequences. Collections research from 130 regional archaeological sites was conducted on shellfish, mammal bone, fish bone, bird bone, and botanical remains, and more than 280 different plants and animals were identified. The tribes took this information and, based on their knowledge of traditional gathering, hunting, and fishing, and food preparation, they've incorporated this data into local health and wellness programs targeting diabetes. This is a cookbook and practical guide for identifying and obtaining traditional foods. More recently, tribes are helping create community food gardens and food trade networks. In summary, I hope these 3 examples presented here encourage discussions this week on the critical need for research-focused museums to strengthen their collections by considering a wider concept of research and collections use. To do this, we first need to include our constituencies at the beginning of projects. Collaborations do not require consensus, but they do require respect and often longer decision-making time. Second, we need to improve access to collections, particularly at an interdisciplinary level. Creating broader networks and sharing environmental and cultural data across borders will be critical to addressing many of our contemporary needs. Increased access, physically, digitally, and collaboratively, will create research that deepens our understanding of the past and addresses the needs of the future. Thank you.